So I am Daniel Holter. I'm a Master Sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. And I am also the one of the founders of a community of practice for facilitation and design and sense making and futures and all of that called Agitare. And what I wanted to talk about for this first campfire, I have a brief amount of material to cover just to kind of rant at you a little bit, but I'm more interested in what you all think about the materials after I put them in front of you and your reflections on some of the activities that we're going to do. So to get us started, though, I have a really short activity for you to do because as a facilitator, I want there to be a little bit of sense making happening through non-traditional kind of not just the default conversation. So I'm going to ask everybody to get a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, and a writing implement. And let me know that you are ready by holding up your writing implement and your piece of paper. And if you don't have your video on, I'd encourage you to turn your video on. It encourages us to see one another as human beings as opposed to this abstract. All right, excellent. I struggle to have deep conversations with faceless boxes on a computer screen. So one of those interface design elements that tends to move us towards the lecturing as opposed to interacting mode. All right, I saw a couple of pieces of paper of those who have their videos on. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take that piece of paper and fold it in half vertically, like long ways. And then I want you to unfold it, make it flat again. And I want you to fold it in half the other way. All right, now unfold it again. So now you have your paper has a center point, right? You've identified that by folding it in half twice. And you're going to place the paper down flat, and you're going to put your pen or pencil, whatever your writing instrument is, at that center point. And I want you to draw a spiral as tightly and slowly as possible. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes to draw your spiral. You're going to draw a really slow, tight spiral. Oh, I didn't say stop drawing your spiral. 2 minutes is a long time. All right. You can stop drawing your spiral. The next thing I'm going to want you to do is write a title in the top left square of your paper, because you have these 4 squares, right, with the spiral in the middle. And the title is Internal World. And under that title, I want you to write 4 things that are on your mind right now, good or bad. And in the top right corner, you're going to put the title External World. And you're going to write 4 things that are happening in the world around you. And in the bottom left square, I want you to title it Past, P-A-S-T. And write 4 things that feel relevant from the past right now. And at the bottom right square, I want you to put Future and put 4 things that are hopes or fears about your future. And once you've got all those things written out, I want you to circle 2 things from your page that you're willing to share with the group. And before we Before we actually ask you to share out, I just want to point out how much silence was in that brief activity, um, and that one of the most powerful and underutilized social instruments is silence. We are programmed to fill silence. It is considered polite to not force others to sit in silence. So people who are silent can be perceived as aloof or antisocial, when a lot of times what is the most powerful reflective tool would be to be silent for a period before we actually share things, because sharing interrupts reflection, which is why silence should always be considered as something that happens in between, right? In between moments of sharing. When we're only conversational, then you give power to people who can come to the things that are important to them quicker than the other people. Having that first mover advantage in a conversation, you get to anchor it, right? It's like in a negotiation. If you get to say the first number, there's an advantage to that. So this is one of the concepts of designing conversational interfaces that to me is really important. How much space are you creating for reflection? And are you leveling the playing field? Right? Most of the time we're not. We use default approaches that kind of privilege extroverts and privilege people who are good communicators, right? Or people who are quickest on their feet. And that's the people who are quickest on their feet aren't the most intelligent. That's a mistake we often make, right? So, all right, who wants to share what they circled on their paper? I'm curious. I don't know what the outputs of this are going to be. Oh, yeah, we have a hand. You don't have to raise your hand. I'd rather this was a unstructured, free-flowing conversation. So, did somebody raise two hands? Can you do that? David, you want to share?
Yeah, sure. So, internal world. I'm working on a curriculum for the senior enlisted Marine Corps students. So E8s. So got a deadline on that. So have to keep head down. And then I'm working on my golf swing. That's kind of internal world. Trying to get my classic car started. Haven't started that for like about 5 years, so I'm trying to do that this weekend and farm stuff. So let's see. External world will be what's going on right now in the United States is election season, fall, and planting trees. So it's a good time to plant trees in the fall. In my past, what we brought here for AOD is my design journey, education in that, in my previous education, and previous life and military experiences. And future is retirement and maintain a good relationship with my wife and children and just other hobbies of interest. So that's all I got.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Is that Noizo? I'm sorry. I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, Gus. Gus is better. It's easier. My first name is Guillaume, but nickname Gus.
Okay.
So the two things that were circled, one is in the past, and I wrote Shoulders of Giants. And the question you ask, do you want to, because I felt it was relevant to the question, so what is important for you in the past, or what's the question?
Yeah, what from your past feels relevant right now?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Shoulders of Giants. I'm a big nerd, especially in stuff like artificial intelligence. So yeah, I feel like we're standing on the shoulder of the giants. So yeah, I feel quite relevant for the future. Basically, and can you say again your statement for the future? Anything that's relevant for the future, or
hopes or fears about the future?
Okay, right. So the one I circled is because it's both. It's being the best version of myself. So it's both the hope and anxiety at the same time.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for sharing. David Connell, can we hear from you?
Yeah, we're going with I'm at a stage now, so internal world. I'm facing retirement sometime in the next 30 to 90 days. So do I make it before or after? So that's kind of consuming me and interfering with other things I'm trying to do or undertake. Do I remain engaged? How much? How little? Anyway, so it's a big thing to decide, and I'm still young, right? So I can't not do anything. Coupled with that, on the test side is my previous marriage. So it focuses on family and how my current marriage and my past marriage and my children factor into, again, my retirement and things. So the two are complementary and intersecting, but separate. Then the external world is where do I see some opportunities that I'd like to participate in, whether they be volunteering with a startup or something like that, or getting involved in an area that'll concern me in the future. For instance, I could go into senior healthcare and try and apply some of my world experience to that to benefit myself and others at this next stage in my life. And then the final one is future hopes and fears. Reflecting back on everything I've said presently, it's the expectation. I'm the only sibling in my family that doesn't have grandchildren yet. So that's something I'm looking forward to experiencing, but I'm fearful because of some of the things in the past. So that's what I'm sharing. A lot of personal stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate it. Sylvie, can we hear from you?
Yeah, sure. This was a great exercise. Thank you so much. And the couple of things I want to share relate to past and future. So in the past, I was thinking as something relevant was the resilience of the planet. And this is in change and climate and everything. So the resilience of the planet was from the past. And for the future, I see learning and adaptation as key capabilities, not only for myself, but everyone around that can help us to address all of those things in either the internal or external world. So those are my shares for today. Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, let's do two more. Adam, can we hear from you?
Yeah, how's everybody doing? All right, so I got, I'll give you one for each one real quick. So internal world, I'm writing, so I think there's probably a lot of writers here, but I've been getting up early writing and revising a lot. That's on my mind. And then external world, fall, beautiful. I love watching the leaves fall and the environment shift during the season. And past, definitely curious about kind of the intellectual journey I took to get drawn here. It's something that I think about a lot. And then the future, definitely kind of a mixture of, excitement and, guardedness. I think we're in for a period of adversity in this time of liminality. So that's probably my best four.
Excellent. Fantastic. And Grant.
The two I circled from the internal world, one of them was politics. So can't go a second without, watching something on TV or Facebook or YouTube telling you about how many evil people would like to run for office and get your vote, and they're all going to screw us on both parties. And then the second one that I circled was from the hopes and fears of the future, academia. I'm trying to finish my dissertation and got a lot of stress because my discipline, public administration, is really trying to get everybody to commit their research to social justice, not objective knowledge, the search for objective knowledge or truth. And it's a really big issue with me, and it's causing a lot of, I think, internal stress to the discipline, because there's people that don't want to do that and there's people that do. So it's very interesting times.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing. All right. Well, thank you everybody for sharing those. I'm kind of taking notes, and the thing I'd like to comment on is the wide variety of things that people chose to highlight out of the elements that they reflected on. I just had my first opportunity to experience Nora Bateson's warm data practice, the online version, which is called People Need People. If you're not familiar, Nora Bateson is a social researcher and academic who does amazing work in complexity theory and transcontextual data, as her father coined. Her father was the one who coined the phrase schismogenesis, and they're deep practitioners in complexity and systems thinking. So the warm data practice is all about identifying and sort of swimming in the muddy waters of transcontextual information with others. And what that means is that all the information in our heads is inextricably tied to a bunch of other things. You can't just extract it and be like, that's a data point, isolated from all these other things. Just like you can't reduce an element of a complex system and be like, this is a leverage point and we'll just manipulate this thing, right? It has to be, you have to consider it still tied to the information there. I think of workshops and design with other human beings and co-creation in a similar way, that all of you, if we were to do an exercise or an activity, everything that you just reflected on is all inextricably linked to the things that you're saying, and you can't help it, right? So the things that are happening in your lives, the way that you're feeling right now, what's happening outside, all of that has an impact. We're not robots. We can't compute things in bits, right? Our thoughts, our neurology doesn't happen in a single part of our brain. Our memories are interconnected bursts of things that are happening in various places in our brains. You can't isolate a memory, right? So this is why we are deeply interconnected with the things around us and one another. And one of the things you're trying to do with facilitation is account for those factors. It's not to, you can't remove them from the picture. It's to account for the existence of those things, try and get people to set them aside, or at least be aware of them, and then maintain an awareness of those things, those biases, those things in the past and present, those things that are affecting us about what we think about the future, and account for them in the design of what it is you're trying to do, right? So what I want to talk about today is thinking of the interfaces that we design in order to navigate complexity or to navigate anything together. And I wanted to give a small example of an interface, which is the spiral journal activity out of Liberating Structures. Liberating Structures is a great source of ideas for facilitated social technologies, right? So I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit. Let me know, how did you experience that activity? Can you tell me what that experience was like? Please don't raise your hand, just speak up.
My experience was pain a little bit because I have developing arthritis in my hand. And when I was doing the circle, I felt some discomfort in my hand. At the same time, though, I thought it was kind of relaxing in a sense that your mind is just kind of focused on the spiral, and make sure, two lines you won't draw a line into another line, but just kind of keep the same distance from lines. And that concentration on that, just kind of blocked out all the other noise in the system. And so after I got over my pain threshold, my arthritic hand, it was kind of, to be honest with you, it was kind of relaxing in a sense. I felt, I was ready to take a nap afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a similar response to, I'm not the physical pain. I apologize for putting you through that. But I have a similar thing where the noise dies down as I'm focusing on the one thing. It's a form of meditation. Who else wants to share what their experience was like in that?
I found some work I was doing earlier, about half an hour ago, dominated my thoughts. So I wasn't able to disassociate the two and be as free or open for that particular exercise because that other activity bled through.
That reminds me of this thing I heard on the Jim Rutt show recently. It was Yuvi Ivanova who was talking about intimacy in facilitation. And she said she went to a conference and she was having trouble arriving. Like she was there, but she was having trouble arriving. And I loved that way of describing the lack of presence in a space with other people. And I think having mechanisms that allow us to check in with ourselves and see whether we have arrived yet is a powerful idea. So I thank you for sharing that. That's great.
I really appreciated David's response to your question, and he expressed what I could not articulate. And I was just amazed how the spiral exercise really forced my mind to concentrate on one thing. And as he was speaking, I was thinking, how could I get more of that? So being completely rude, I tried a little experiment. And I tried drawing the spiral with my left hand, and it required even more concentration. So I'm going to take this away as a bit of a mindfulness exercise. So thank you for that.
Yeah, lovely. I do the same thing. I now kind of employ it a little bit like square breathing. If you're familiar, square breathing is a mindfulness, relaxation, anti-anxiety practice. I use it constantly. Just think about the square and going around the square. 2 seconds in, hold, 2 seconds, 2 seconds out. The spiral does a very similar thing, except without the breathing. So,
Being left-handed, I support everybody trying to use their left hand more.
Okay. Things are getting out of hand. I don't want things to get really too political here. So.
If I may quickly,
yeah, Gus.
To be frank, I'm probably the opposite of everything you've said. I felt
Sure.
discomfort because I'm purpose driven, and it's I knew I'm here to do the thing, but to focus on something like this, it was difficult for me.
Yeah.
to jump in.
That makes sense. Do you feel like the spiral did anything for your reflections after you did the spiral?
Actually, it's your comment about the silence that was quite. I'm one of those, I guess. It's easier when I speak my own language, but that is extroverted and can be a good communicator. So that's what the silence and the yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that we can design a thing to create an equal effect for all participants. That is nonsense. People are so vastly different from one another that even in fields of like behavioral economics, which is all about nudging people, right? They're just looking to cross a certain threshold of impact. They're not looking for a universal impact. So we should be very careful about the idea that, oh, this is designed this way, so it has this effect. No, it might have a completely opposite effect on certain people. And so, we need to, one of the mistakes we've made in the selection of social technologies in historically has been to think that all people are the same, and therefore this way is what suits us best. When, because people are so different, you go, well, this is supposed to have this impact, but if it's not having that impact, then we will adjust. But also, we diversify so that nobody is, universally privileged in the participation. So that's really great to hear that sort of paradoxical, what's it called, a paradoxical reaction when people take a medicine and it does the opposite of what it was intended to. Anybody else?
I have something, but I know Grant and Pierre-Marie also have their hands up, so happy to go after them.
Yeah, no, we don't need to raise hands to talk here.
I forgot to take my hand down, but I'll go ahead and just throw out. I was thinking, this is a design exercise, so I wonder what we're really doing here, and I was trying to figure that out, but also not cross the line.
Yeah, you're trying to get ahead of the game and anticipate the outputs. It's one of the terrible thing about clever people is that they're always trying to game it. They're like, what are they trying to do to me? What's the surprise that I can, get ahead of?
So I have a comment to complement what others shared so I was fine. I was very happy to start my little spiral at the very beginning, but then one of the things that came up for me, and that's a deformation, I guess, from doing kind of the doctoral studies, is I asked myself, what's the definition of a spiral? And so as I realized I was doing this, this is what it came out to. You can't really see, but I started as a circle and then questioned that this isn't really a spiral. And so then I started doing spiral going in a different direction. So I thought that was really interesting. And in relation to your comment, what did the spiral do? I think it started me on the next reflection that you had, which is about the different directions. In indigenous thinking, we have the different directions. And so, so basically around this is whatever definition we apply to what we're doing is going to shape how we think about it and ultimately how we act. So that was my reflection on that.
As for me, I was drawing my spiral comfortably. I was happy. It was beautiful. It was nice. Not like our friend. I was very happy. And suddenly I was confronted brutally to my cultural barrier, because I'm French speaking, and it was very easy for me to be in the spiral. But when you began to set some indications of things to do that are very generic, very abstract, I had a lot of great difficulty to switch from that simple. And I discovered that it is not the same thing to speak English, to try to speak English, to hear in a conversation, and to catch in real time orders to do something that are combined with another activity that you have done that has nothing to do. So I was lost after the spiral. But this is great to discover that. I was lost because the difficulty to understand and the sound in English, I was really lost and I didn't catch what to do. It is as stupid as that. No, but it is very interesting for me to discover that. It's not the same thing to try to discuss, to express his feeling and so on, and to try to catch in real time when you are not good at hearing your non-mother language. So it was a complete disruption for me. It was very strange. I was lost.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And it kind of makes me think of things usually when I'm doing an activity, I'll give verbal instructions and I'll put the written instructions in front of people so that they can, interpret the instructions at their own pace. But also there is reason to think that language is effortful, right? Whereas when we move into symbols, like ask people to draw things, or for example, when we're doing something like Lego Serious Play, they're not required to do that task of translating even into their own language. There's a translation that has to happen between what I think, what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling, and how do I express it, right? Part of that, and I'm going to go now into the part where I kind of describe my reflections on the spiral journal activity. Part of that, one reason we ask people to draw things in design activities, draw a picture of this thing, is because it occupies a different part of your brain. You generate different kinds of things, and you also do several loops of different types of reflections before you draw a symbol of something, as opposed to just picking language for it. Okay. When I write something down, though, instead of just thinking, in the book Design Unbound, which is a fantastic book on design, if you haven't read it, they talk about the hand as a thinking tool. And I was reflecting on that this morning because I do a lot of journaling, and I use interfaces like Miro, and I take notes, not because I'm going to read that later. I use it as a method of thinking. And the way that works, I was reflecting on this idea of the hand as a cognitive extension. And what I realized was when we have a thought, like we think something, it's like something that happens to us, right? We're kind of the subject of our thoughts. We just sitting there and thoughts occur to us, and then other thoughts happen, and there's not a ton of agency exercised in that. It's kind of like you're meandering through just thoughts as they happen, right? Of course, you can argue about how much agency there is. That's not the point. But to write a thought down is to deliberately engage with it, to choose language that actually represents that thought, and then bring it into a concrete plane. And then you're like anchored to it, right? And you can start to do things, and your subsequent thoughts are going to continue to bounce off of that thing that you wrote down, because it's there now, because it's persistent, as opposed to when we're just thinking in our heads. Okay. So I think about this idea of making an artifact out of thinking. I think about it a lot because, for example, if you were to do a design activity in which there was no creation of artifacts, it would be very difficult to carry what had happened in previous stages into subsequent stages. So when I'm designing a workshop, I'm constantly thinking, what needs to be fluid and ethereal and fall through the cracks and disappear forever, and what needs to be persistent? What needs to be put in front of them that they can reach back and go, oh, but this was something that we wanted to stay anchored to, for example. Or, oh, this was an ingredient that was supposed to be involved, and now I can see that it's missing, right? So when in Spiral Journal, when I give you a number of thoughts to write down, it constrains you to select 4. Maybe it's the 4 most important. Maybe it's the 4 most, the 4 first things that occur to you, right? So it's an example of divergence and convergence when you give people a limit like that, because they're going to have more than 4 things, and they're going to pick 4, right? So is the circling of items. It is an example of convergence. You came up with 4 things from 4 different disparate, categories that I had come up with, which I considered to be useful for reflection on where I am and what's happening to me internally and externally. And then you select 2. And that selection process is a different type of reflection, right? It's a type of convergence on which of those things matter most to you. So I have been reflecting on this idea of workshops, because I do a lot of workshops. I design workshops for problem solving, for the design of products, and for establishing design criteria, for policy, for a variety of, or just to spend time and reflect and make progress, or achieve alignment or set a vision, or, it can be for any number of things. But when I think about design, design is such a fuzzy term. I often think in terms of just getting groups to navigate some sort of complex thing together and give shape to something, to arrive at a shared set of criteria or arrive at a shared set of values. So you can design strategy. You can, a lot of people think in terms of designing products. You can design your values as an organization. And so I think through this lens of the workshop is an interface. So the reason I like thinking of the workshop as interface, I think that this came into my head from Dave Gray, who wrote the book Liminal Thinking. And he had this really simple illustration of what happens in a conversation where most of the time there's information in my head and there's information in the other person's head. And if we have a disagreement, we're trying to change the information in one another's heads, right? I'm just trying to change what's inside your head, and you're trying to change what's inside my head. Or we're sharing and we're collectively building up, I'm like building what's in my head, you're building what's in your head. It's going to look very different. And if there is a disagreement, that's usually ineffective, a conversation. Because we have this framing of, I'm trying to change your mental model, you're trying to change my mental model, it's competitive. So Dave Gray presents this really simple illustration of, let's introduce a whiteboard, right? And now instead of facing each other, we're both facing the same direction, okay? And then we both start drawing some depiction of what we think reality is together. Instead of trying to update one another's mental models, we're working to collaborate on the shared artifact, right? The artifact being a persistent thing that we can reflect on and go, well, does that match my internal understanding? We have that conversation with the artifact, and it becomes a collaborative exercise for us to build that together, and until it is an agreed upon shared item. So I use collaborative mapping a lot. And this is where I initially got this idea of workshops as interface, is because that is very clearly an interface. And an interface is defined as the point where two systems communicate, basically. It's the means by which interaction or communication is achieved between two systems, okay? So the interface on a phone is, the interface or user interface on an application is where me, the system, interacts or communicates with the system of the software, right? So if you and I are trying to have a conversation, the conversation is the interface, that social technology that we're employing. And we can select and design that interface for different effects. And the most simple example is when we choose to face the same direction and collaboratively draw on a whiteboard a world that includes both of our perspectives, right? Or arrives at a compromise between our shared perspectives. And I've seen the simplest exercises in collaborative mapping result in very deep emotional, like we're getting through something really difficult together that was hinged on something as simple as the phrasing on a sticky note. And the reason that that happens is because what that phrasing, how that interacts with my internal world is different from how it interacts with your internal world. We reflected on everything that's going on inside our heads and in our lives and all of that, right? There is no, this is sort of designs for the pluriverse here. We operate, we exist in separate ontologies, right? So trying to arrive at the same one isn't the point. It's to create something that is coherent with both of ours. So we're not trying to colonize one another's worlds. We're trying to create something that can exist in both of our worlds. And that's like this idea that, oh, we create something that works for most people and then we just berate the people that it doesn't work for. That's the way things usually work. Like that's our standard operating procedure. We build a thing and then the people who fall outside the margins, there's something wrong with them, right? And this is why design thinking has become a thing, is because co-creation and deep ethnography and incorporating the voices of the end user and incorporating the voices of people who are used to not be in that room where design was occurring, that is now considered to be a valuable effort. Yes, David, go ahead.
Yeah, so in your exercise or application, when you have creating a model that kind of demonstrates different perspectives, it sounds to me that you also have kind of like evidence of empathy here, right? In a sense that my perspective may be different from yours. However, we're trying to build this joint model, and I can empathize with the way you see the world, and kind of like red team technique, 4 ways of seeing, possibly. That's what it kind of reminds me of. Though, 4 ways of seeing is not necessarily model building, but it's the same aspect of, experiencing empathy with your co-creator.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that models often help us build empathy because most of the time we don't get to the conversation about why this matters to me. Most of the time we are on that surface level of this is what I think should be the case. And when we surface those things of, oh, but you think it should be that case and I think it should be this case, now we have to have a conversation about why. What would we have to know in order to pick between those two? I'm not saying that there isn't objective reality, right? Sometimes we identify a disagreement and we can go, oh, but we could find that out, right? Like, I think it should be this way, you think it should be that way. What does deciding between those depend on? Well, it depends on something that we can measure. Let's go measure it, right? But at the same time, a lot of things don't come down to objectively measurable things. They come down to the way that I feel about what this represents, or things that I've experienced, or what I think that's going to result in the future, right? And now you have to empathize with how I'm seeing that model. So I think, I absolutely think that mapping is a way for us to achieve, get access to one another's deeper inner worlds and like that gain empathy for one another, because it forces you to go deeper. So one thing that I like about, in mapping and in a spiral journal activity and in writing and sticky note exercises is putting things in physical space so that we can see them near one another. It does this thing to our brains as opposed to just thinking them in sequence, or as opposed to I have my idea, you have your idea, and we're just kind of throwing it back and forth. When we put those two ideas next to each other and we go, is there a world in which these two can coexist? Or what am I actually, why do I actually care about it looking that way? And then we can go a little bit deeper and go, oh, I'm actually just really concerned about this particular aspect of it. I just want to make sure that, like the voices of these people are heard. Well, we could include your aspect and also make sure that the voices of those people are heard, and suddenly we've resolved the issue. It wasn't about the physical representation. It was about something deeper. It was about how it might impact people. So putting things in physical space has that impact. It helps us in our thinking. And that's one way to think, one reason I think that this thinking through the lens of interfaces, as opposed to, it's I don't know. I get the sense that people think of workshops as like, oh, you do the moves and then this cool stuff comes out. No, it's a designed implement, and it's designed specifically to create certain effects, right? To give people access to that underlying complexity. So the activity we did, and how is it designed, right? It was designed, you created an artifact. There was a ritual and practice element to it, right? There was a facilitation element to it where I said, hey, keep drawing your spiral. I didn't tell you to stop, right? And things like that. Those kinds of things you need. There are protocols, there are artifacts, there are practices and rituals. And those tend to be the usual media that we use to design the interface that is a workshop, right? In the case of the Spiral Journal, it's designed to increase reflection and individual sense making, right? Through a very simple practice of meditative reflection and divergence and convergence. Okay, I added this. Sometimes I'll add a 1, 2, 4 all when I have the ability to breakout rooms, which is a liberating structure, is a very simple facilitated practice where you just have people have small conversations and then move them to a large group. Yeah, David?
So these dichotomy of ideas are pretty interesting. So one of my colleagues attended the United States Navy Institute conference, and they had a guest lecture, and I can share these notes with you guys. Figure a way to do that. But Dr. Hall Brands, and this is one of so United States, certainly with the United States military, DoD, they certainly have a competition with China with the littorals, sea lanes communication. But one thing that he said was kind of interesting is that we need to think about ways we can cooperate with China to make our competitive efforts sustainable in the long run. So those are two kind of different things. So in order for us to have a national strategy with China, it's more it's more of cooperation that will benefit our competition. So, how can those two things exist? And I think if you kind of look at some of our commonalities between the United States and China, well, there's climate change, but there's also a dependence of manufacture. There's also dependence of foodstuff in the United States, as well as North America, to include Canada with China. So from what you're talking about, two divergent ideas in perspective, this can also be applied to, strategy. Over.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it reminds me of this idea of Dan Ward recently turned me on to this book about managing polarities rather than solving problems. Sometimes by framing something as a problem to be solved, we then, like, complex systems aren't problems. You can, if you subscribe to the thinking of like Dave Snowden, you can basically only nudge them into an adjacent possible state. You can't solve them, right? So I thinking in terms of those paradoxes or those polarities, that reminds me, of that concept. It's about creating conditions for things to move in a better direction, as opposed to this idea, I saw some chatter about finite versus infinite games. We're not trying to win against China. That's a silly framing. What are we going to make them not exist anymore? We're trying to move things into a better adjacent possible state. So how do we nudge that? And I like that idea of cooperation being a pathway, being a channel that might be accessible to us, that creates, increases, more stories like this, fewer stories like that kind of thing.
To one of your point, what Sylvia talked about when she's thinking about, nature, nature is a complex system where different flora and fauna, different species develop certain relationships, for thousands of years, right? It's complex, but it also is harmonistic in a sense. Over.
Yeah.
Also, nature, we get, I'll say a word about that. Also from nature, we get that sense of an ecosystem, and we've started to adapt that ecological awareness to our human systems. And there's something we can learn about organization and about that nudging. I really like how you're, Daniel, how you're presenting this notion of nudging versus solving a problem. It's a very helpful way of thinking about moving away from the straight line, from cause and effect that we're kind of trained to think through, and to allow for this divergence. So I really like those images and examples that you're giving. I find it very helpful.
Yeah, when I think of like an ecosystem, the only time that they really change in drastic and significant ways in a burst is when they collapse. You don't see like these rapid, like, it explosively flourished. That's not the most common form of rapid shift.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily collapse. It would just take, a different form, right? So, when you had the Ice Age come in, right?
Yeah.
So certain flora and fauna went extinct or moved on.
Yeah.
But the Ice Age created a different ecosystem.
Yes.
Just like, you have climate changes when one area was, a tropical rainforest like Montana, is now has a different ecosystem. So, it just transforms, I guess. Over.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I do want to talk, bringing it back to the concept of the workshop as interface, because I've done a little bit of work on this, and I'm going to share some of Austin Wiggins is in this call, so Austin, feel free to jump in and share. But Austin and I have collaborated on thinking of meetings as an interface, as a designed interface for interaction. And we did a lot of research and worked out some theory and read some books. But I wanted to just talk about some of the design criteria for a gathering. An example of a facilitated kind of design or reflection activity for me, a really simple, is a retrospective. And when we think about the design of these social interfaces, we think about the effects we're trying to create. What are the goals, right? And in order to reach those goals, what effects do we need? What dynamics do we need to create? What are we trying to create? Particular outputs or artifacts? What is the ideal timing based on those dynamics? Those dynamics often result in, well, in order to have this happen, we need this really high rate of engagement or this really high level of energy that can only be sustained for a certain period of time, right? Same goes for low levels of energy. If you have something, the military staff meeting is famous. It's just such a poorly designed interface for engagement. I often think that people don't really understand what their goals are when they hold those. They're just doing what they've been kind of programmed to do. And the protocols. Protocols are really important in the design of a social interface. The protocols are just whatever our protocols are in the military generally, right? Which means that all of those power dynamics are still there. We don't speak openly. The most important person is sitting at the head of the table. Usually it's just, it's a hippo. It's the highest paid person's opinion wins the conversation. There are other ways to design things, right? You look at Amazon meetings in which people read silently together and then reflect together on what their feedback is. But we were thinking as facilitators, what protocols, what constraints do we put in place for a retrospective? How complex, what modules are there? In a retrospective, there's silent generation. Everybody silently writes items on sticky notes. This equalizes the voices, it depersonalizes, it causes us to reflect on the elements themselves rather than being in competition with one another. And then after the silent generation portion, which is a medium complexity, low energy, low engagement, low conflict, but high sensing task, right? So it might even make sense in particular groups to go, well, we want them to be sensing or reflecting deeply on this. What do we do before the silent generation in order to prime that? That's a design criteria that you would want to account for, right? And then there's a discussion, affirmation, and generation of action items portion. And you want, for example, higher energy and higher engagement. And you do want some conflict there, because if everybody is agreeing, then you're not exploring deeply enough, right? So that's just kind of to present for you what we came up with in the design of a diagnostic that's supposed to help people navigate this thing. I don't know how to stop sharing, honestly. Oh, there it is. And I did have one other thing I wanted to share, but I'm just curious if any of you have any reflections or reactions to that.
On your comment about meetings, I like you reminded me of the work's been done, and I know Ben Zweibelson has done some stuff on this, but and then there's a lot of stuff on the literature about meetings being more ritualistic, as opposed to learning or innovation.
Yes, and ritual is really important in culture for reinforcing the things that we consider valuable. And I'm going to get to Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus here in a moment, because that is very relevant in my view. Anybody else have reflections on meetings or the design of meetings?
Yeah, I've got a couple points. I thought about this in the past, and I think you expressed it better than I could, but I see the battle rhythm of a headquarters particularly, or a joint headquarters in particular. The battle rhythm is made up of a series of these meetings that you've described, as opposed to, really exploring the complexity, trying to find out, some of those factors of what affects, what outputs are we interested in. So they tend to rely on, inputs and actions rather than the other end. So what it brings to me is two aspects. One is, in addition to those factors that you outline, the makeup of who's attending those meetings. So if we really want to get the right things out of it, it can't be mechanistic that, all the J1 or J leads meet, or, we have so many meetings on that battle rhythm, the same people go to these various meetings. So you're not getting any different social or cognitive inputs and perspectives to address that transition, that journey towards outputs and expectations. And then the second one that brings to mind for me, again, falling back on this dynamic that I think is broken, is do we need in a headquarters or in an organization some people that are facilitators? So they're not dedicated to a particular branch, section, directorate, but they're internal to the organization. They act as facilitators, and now they become super empowered individuals in that organization because they're actually interfacing across the various directorates, and they become very information smart and can integrate, can connect, can exercise that freedom of association and not personal responsibility for certain things. So those are the reflections I have based on that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for saying it so I didn't have to, because I'm always the one who says every organization needs somebody who's managing the social technology. And by that, I don't mean managing the IT of the social technology. I mean managing whether those are producing the social effects that we need. Organizations that have, for example, community managers have a significant advantage in the management of culture and exchange and equity and inclusion, because they are watching that domain that is invisible when all you're watching is the tech, right? We're not just talking about, does everybody have the tool, and does everybody have Teams? Can they access it? Okay, we're good to go. Except for if you're a facilitator, you understand that having the capacity to speak is not the same as actually speaking. And the effects that you want aren't based on whether people have the capacity to speak. The effects are based on whether they are actually speaking, right? And the context of that speech, and what artifacts are created when they speak, and what happens next as a result of that speech. That's the purview of facilitators. And so in workshop design, it naturally led me to think of meetings. Meetings can be thought of in the same way as workshops, but we don't tend to. Why?
Exactly. Thank you. And the other aspect of it is, when you have that leader up front, predominantly the leaders, again, in military context, predominantly the leaders, the commanders, come from the operational branches of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. But when we start looking at complexity and multi-domain operations, it's not an Army, an Air Force, or a Navy problem predominantly. And so sometimes you need those other divergent characters and experience to actually come to an idea of what actually might work in a particular situation. And then I have a question for you. You reminded me of it. So I like the aspect that we get the shared understanding of a problem by not conflating each of our own perspective, by sharing the perspective. The problem is, how do you then share that shared perspective with others? And we default to using language, and the language limits it again and actually narrows it, that others don't see the perspective that you have. And so I'm wondering how we talk that, so the outputs become beneficial to everyone and not just the people who are in the meeting.
Yeah. Well, there's two things there. One is, if you need the voices of people who were not in the meeting, then one problem that I've seen people have is the creation of completed artifacts that they then share out for feedback. This is a common way that people try and approach the problem you just described. But when you put a completed product in front of people, especially if there's a power dynamic there where you're in charge and you're like, hey, I'm getting feedback from my people, and you put a finished product in front of them, they're going to say, that looks fine. The solution, in my experience, is to put something that is flawed, that is flawed, that has all of the markers of, this is not a completed product. We didn't arrive at a conclusion. So it is necessary in co-creation because that's the solution, is co-creation, is having a co-creative process. So either to collect, to get that co-creative input prior to the meeting, so that, and then make it so that people can see that what happened in that co-creation was, fed into the process, or to put something, a prototype, not a finished product, in their hands so that they can adjust it, right? So yes, there's any time that you are and my view is that if there is a risk of people feeling like they should have had a voice, then you are better off just including them in the process. If they want to spend their time and that feels valuable to them doing that, then you need to, instead of making decisions in a closed, like room just for people of a certain authority, then you need to make that a transparent and participatory process. So it's about shifting the order of things. One, their input comes before the, hey, look what we built. And then the other thing is shift the technology to make them feel like they actually had a voice. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, to an extent.
David, can I just, the way I understood your question was, how do you share abstraction? That's what I understood your question was, because you said when you write something down, basically you writing something down is kind of a convergent exercise, right? Your point in your question, you were like, how do you share like a higher level of abstraction?
Okay. Yeah.
Like, what? No, but I mean, I'm not sure that's his question though. But that's how I understood your question.
I did hear that, and it did have a thought that I lost while I was talking. It was that if you, in a workshop, I always try to build several layers of abstraction. We are doing this thing, but we're doing it because we're trying to create this effect. And we're trying to create this effect because we have these values, for example. And so there's a chain of logic that we have consented to, right? That this matters, this outcome matters. And our hypothesis is that the creation of this product or policy or to do this thing is going to support those values by having this effect, and then achieving consensus or consent rather in that, well, this is what we're going to try and we'll see if it creates that. Having that chain is how you get people to have shared abstraction. Is what, for example, values are an abstraction, right? Like our organizational values are this, and they can be very muddy and fuzzy and difficult to pin down. So you go a level of abstraction down into the concrete and you say, this is what those values look like in the real world. These are our protocols that enforce those values. And being tied to something concrete, having a chain of logic from one level of abstraction to another is what causes people to have coherence from person to person in knowing what that, in having those abstractions mean the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like all of that. I use a metaphor.
Yes.
With the commander's intent, and I've seen it in rooms, people arguing about what the intent actually intends, because they all have a different perspective. Yeah. So that's difficult. And so we go to the next level, a little lower level of abstraction, the lines of effort, et cetera, et cetera. But here we end up, again, it becomes a requirements buffet. And so now, farther down the chain, I can look up, and it's a buffet of requirements. So I can come up with any action I want, and I can justify it by looking up at this buffet and saying, yeah, I got so many calories here, I got a few calories there, I got a few calories there. I can do this thing, and it's going to be really good. But it doesn't achieve anything. They're hollow calories. They're empty calories. There's too much sugar. There's not enough this. So we distill out that finite thing that we're actually trying to accomplish. And I guess that's an aspect of what I was trying to get at, but have trouble conveying that. So if we have facilitation throughout an organization and not just at one level, perhaps we can get at that better thing. And then one final thing, sorry to occupy the discussion.
No, not at all.
Is what are the barriers to doing some of that? And again, in a security context, the barriers are, we don't have enough time to include everybody. We don't have enough time to run the plan by everybody and get their inputs and perspectives. The classification, it's too sensitive. We can't expose it to other people. So like I've actually been in rooms where I've been brought in as an SME. Oh, but I don't have, the special access clearance. So they kicked me out of the room that they needed me in to discuss and share. Like ridiculous stuff sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's enormous barriers. One of them is that we occupy so much of people's time with hollow rituals that they don't want to give us any of their time because they already feel like their time is wasted and they don't have it. They don't have any to give. So part of strategy, when you talk about having that requirements buffet, part of strategy should be about deciding what we're not doing because we need to constrain ourselves in order to be coherent. Which means this is why I like a method like objectives and key results, which says you don't get more than 3 to 5 objectives. And if you have 20 objectives, you're going to do only a couple of them really badly. So, it's achieving that coherence is also about attenuation of effort. So I really, there are so many barriers and I've done it. I've had it be really not impactful in the past many times because of those barriers. So, and I don't think that there are fixed rules that would apply to every organization. I think that one thing that every facilitator needs to understand is that they are designing what's going to work for this context, and it's going to look different in every context for every client. There's one other thing I do want to share because I worked on it prior to this, and I'm kind of excited about it. It might seem a little abstract to some. It is a systems map of the workshop as interface, and it hinges on, I'm a sociology student, so it hinges on Pierre Bourdieu's theory of habitus, which is a sociological concept. Our habitus is how we speak and hold ourselves, which is called hexis. And then it's these schemes of perception and classification and appreciation and the way that we feel and schemes of action. And these things, they affect the way that we behave. They affect the things that we value. They affect the way that we see the world. They can be understood as mental models, right? And the goal of a workshop as an interface using this concept of habitus is that the interface of the workshop has these design elements, the goals, the dynamics, and the drivers and constraints. We, as facilitators, when we design a workshop, we impose drivers and constraints in order to direct the participants, in order to suppress those schemes or invoke them when we want them to bring them into play, to create a world where the rules are different. So one of the things about habitus is that it affects our concept of what will gain us cultural capital, right? So because of the cultural field that we occupy, we behave in certain ways. We are internally constrained by these schemes to speak and hold ourselves in these kinds of ways that are consistent or coherent with the cultural field we occupy. So that's why when we facilitate a workshop, we ask people to remove symbols of those things, right? Of the cultural field. We ask people to remove rank, come in civilian clothes. We're going to call each other by our first names. All of those drivers, constraints, those, modulating the dynamics, the goal there is to try and create a new cultural field in which the rules are different, in which people are safe and capable of participating to the degree that you need them to. I wouldn't tell people we need to change all those cultural elements in order to have a daily stand-up. That would be a big waste of everybody's time. And we can, but if we're going to have for example, a strategic offsite, and we want to be able to challenge the strategic direction, then we need to find ways of suppressing those schemes that perpetuate culture. One of the things about Habitus is the theory of Habitus is that we are constantly our Habitus is programmed by the structures that we occupy, and it drives us to recreate those structures. So it's not entirely a structurist perspective, although some have accused it of being sort of structuralist. It attempts to merge the objective and the subjective into this one kind of unifying theory. Some say it does that effectively, some say it doesn't. But one thing that we can take away from the concept is that as the workshop facilitators, we have to account for those internal constraints and create conditions for the cultural field to not express itself or try and recreate itself within that context, right? As a system, what we're doing with dynamics is we're trying to affect the posture and of the participants towards one another. Like I showed you those design criteria, those dynamics in a retrospective. What's the energy we want to create? I'm not one of those facilitators who thinks that everything has to be fun and playful and exciting. I think that it's really important for us to be quiet and reflective, and that's often the one that's missing, right? And then there's this feedback process, which is hugely important for facilitators because there's this adjusting feedback based on what they're seeing happen in the participant experience and them knowing what the goals of that workshop are, and they modulate, they adjust the driver's constraints. I am constantly changing the dynamics because I see it not producing the effects that I want, right? In order to vector the participants to create, whatever it is we're trying to create. And one way of understanding the workshop as interface is that the whole goal of this is sense making, which is a fuzzy term, which I think is useful in this case, that we have our existing mental models, we have shared strong mental models that are reinforced by the cultural field. We have individuals with their own personal intentions, right? Their own agendas. We have our visions of possible futures, and through the workshop, we try and adjust those intentions or get them to reveal ethnographic info in interaction with mental models. The goal being that we have updated and new emergent mental models that can be informative of what happens next, right? That drives action. So I just kind of wanted to share that as a way of visualizing. I like systems mapping. This was produced with Austin Wiggins, who it looks like maybe has left the call. Austin is my systems thinking collaborator on a lot of things. So we so he was very helpful in that. But I would like to just give the last few minutes of this call to whoever has comments or questions or whatever else they want to surface.
I'd just like to say thank you for creating this interface as you would describe it, and giving us an opportunity to think very strategically and from a design perspective about all of these spaces that we create. And it's going to take me a while to assimilate everything that was shared, by everyone. And a couple of elements I would add around the design elements we need to be conscious of is the notion of time and space, especially in these hybrid workplaces that use technology. The notion of the space of the meeting is something that is a little bit more complex. And the notion of time, the fact, and you alluded to it and as the conversation evolved, that it's not just a meeting, it's what happens in the pre-meeting and the post-meeting, and how do we manage that space. And so anyways, thank you for all of the insights and for everyone's input. I really appreciated being a part of this discussion.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
If I can jump in again. Thank you very much, Danielle. And it really, your presentation today, or the discussion we had, I should say, was really I was your PT part, like your target audience, because you seem to be really a practice focus, which is something I'm more like. That's how I like. I have lots of admiration for academia, but it's not me, right? Yes, thank you, and probably gonna DM you to get some of your tips and tricks of the trades and reference going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Well, before we part, if I may, Dan, thank you so much for this. It was extremely refreshing for me. I didn't share, but what I had in terms of internal world was planning, headache, course design, and team. And now I would have to redo this list because it's very refreshing. Again, when we focus so much time planning, strategizing, and all that, it's good to get back to why we are together as a community. It's really to learn and grow together and from one another, and I really I think you really set conditions for me to grow as a facilitator and as a workshop designer. The other word I would throw in there from both Joe is reflexivity. When we do these meetings and all that, we do it in an unthinking way because it's something we've been doing forever. But we can really think more about what is the intent of the meeting, what we want to achieve, and what are the best way we can design it to take us somewhere else than just for the sake of a mere ritual. So thank you so much. It's extremely refreshing, and I really look forward to Adam's session in less than a month. And Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, but we still have a slot available for a monthly campfire in December. And it's something that anybody from the network can participate. So if you have an idea of something you'd like to take around the campfire, go for it. You can pitch it to Dan, Alter, and Michael. And again, I think the key rule is that there needs to be at least like a 20-minute-ish of interactive activity like the one that Dan did with the spiral and the paper. So again, Dan, thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to tell you, I think Austin Wiggins will be taking December. So we have a pretty good lineup out to February. It looks like if OFRA is going to do January. So we're taking people for March of 2023 for the next campfire. But yeah, thank you to everybody. Grant, you had something? Sorry.
Yeah, no, just at the risk of going philosophical or academic, although I think this has a practitioner angle. One of the things that I've noticed, my very light reading in the sociological literature, is the idea of trying to get away from the hierarchy and all these things, which is needed and for innovative reasons, et cetera. But I'm interested. It seems to me they don't really address too much the replacing of the hierarchy with a new hierarchy. It's the language seems to be very hubristic, and it seems to me that in my own experience, when we replace a hierarchy in the military, another one comes along, and I'm just interested in that. I don't really see that in the literature or the military folks talking innovation. That seems to me to be the sort of the rule, and that you don't necessarily. You won't ever overcome it because it's kind of human nature, but you do at least acknowledge it. And I just really haven't heard that from the sociological side. And again, I'm very thin on it, but the language I hear at NC State is very hubristic. If we just replace the current hierarchy, everything will be great. And I sort of see the same thing on the military side. If we just do X or innovate X or change this thing, things will be great. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of humility in this sense that, no, that's actually the default. Let's acknowledge it and figure out how we're going to deal with that. But any comments on those?
Well, if I can jump in, you got to read Pierre Bourdieu and Michel Foucault, because it's all about this. When you do a revolution and you throw away the top of the hierarchy, well, you're just going to get a different form of hierarchy and power structure, right? So and there is no real way to get away from it, but as you put it, to bring awareness to it, so we can at least do something about it. But yeah, that's.
I thought, I just finished The Dawn of Everything by David Wengrow and David Graeber, and they make a really compelling case for the idea that we are trapped in thinking that hierarchy is the default, that we've become sort of trapped in this particular mode of thinking that was not the case prior to, say, 5,000 years ago. And it's not for the same reasons that most, like Yuval Harari or Daniel, or Steven Pinker have been saying, which is that the agricultural revolution changed everything. It's that we have, because of that concept of habitus, that we rebuild the structures that we are kind of programmed to see the world through, that we tend to think that hierarchy is inevitable, that, that's the only social technology that accomplishes certain effects. And they share in that book, it's a massive, right here. It's the dawn of everything. And it tells throughout prehistory examples of cultures that took a different tact and used alternative methods. So I agree with you that we do tend to replace, we just take off the surface layer and then it gets replaced, but the structure is the same. We've taken what is a scaffold and we've turned it into a fixed and permanent structure, except for it doesn't have to be permanent. There are alternatives. For example, and I'm actually writing a paper about why the military struggles in this regard through the lens of Bourdieu's concept of habitus and cultural capital, and there was some great discussion in the Discord around this. And I think we could have a little bit more creativity. And you see that kind of creativity in the private sector and organizations that are using, holacracy and duocracy and these alternative social technologies that are seem impossible to people who think the only way to manage human beings is through hierarchy, or rather through the kind of hierarchy where you use the threat of violence or expulsion to compel people to do your will. There are alternatives there. I'm not saying that they're necessarily the ideal fit, for the military, but I do think we don't ask ourselves the question enough about why are we doing things this way? Why are there this many tiers in the hierarchy? And does that make sense? Why is a finance squadron in the Air Force structured the exact same way as an intel squadron in the Air Force? How does that make any sense? If we were designing structure based on desired outputs, and I'll go back to Conway's law and the book Team Topologies, Conway's law says that our outputs will resemble the structure of our organization. And that happens in the software field because the software field has had a very active, double and triple loop learning happening in ways that most other sectors have not. So, and it's, because of the nature of that sector, I believe I'm still kind of exploring it. But if we were structuring organizations based on desired outputs, a finance squadron would look structurally different from an intel squadron, but they don't.
Yeah, and we could talk hours about all the stuff you just mentioned. So I would say that begs the question, what is the purpose of the military? Is it really national security?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I can't answer. Not because I'll get in trouble if I do. All right. Well, thank you everybody so much for participating and for listening to me rant. It's a joy to share my thinking with you, and I look forward to seeing you all in Discord in the interim.
Yeah, we have a monthly campfire open channel in Discord, so we can continue the conversation there. So I look forward to see you all there.